The merchant ship breaks apart like kindling beneath the fury of the Atlantic storm. Lightning illuminates the chaos as sailors scream and wooden planks scatter across mountainous waves. Through the tempest, a woman fights desperately against the pull of dark waters that want to claim her as their own. Then strong hands seize her wrists. Captain Blackwood hauls her onto his ship with practiced efficiency, water streaming from her torn dress as she collapses on rain-slicked deck. His crew watches silently as he kneels beside her, studying her face in the lightning's brief glow. She opens her eyes to find his weathered face inches from hers, scarred by battles and marked by years commanding the most feared vessel in these waters. His voice cuts through wind and thunder with unexpected gentleness. "Come with me. You need saving. I need a queen." But can two people from different worlds find love when survival means choosing between freedom and fate? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Consciousness returned slowly, like surfacing from the deepest ocean depths. The woman's eyes fluttered open to find herself surrounded by polished mahogany and brass fittings that gleamed in the soft light, filtering through diamond-paned windows. This wasn't the merchant vessel she remembered. The bed beneath her was far too comfortable, draped in rich burgundy silk that spoke of wealth and taste. She sat up carefully, her body protesting with aches that reminded her of her near drowning. Her sodden dress had been replaced with a clean white chemise and a simple brown skirt. Someone had tended to her with surprising gentleness. The captain's quarters, for that's surely where she was, revealed a man of contradictions. Charts and nautical instruments shared space with leather-bound volumes of poetry and philosophy. A crystal decanter filled with amber liquid sat beside a simple wooden cross. The most striking feature was a brass compass mounted on the desk, its needle spinning wildly before settling on a direction that definitely wasn't north. Memory fragments danced just beyond her reach. Isabella, the name came to her suddenly, along with flashes of her father's worried face and urgent warnings about traveling by sea. She was Isabella Ashworth, daughter of a successful merchant, though why that felt incomplete, she couldn't say. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss, Captain says you might be stirring." The voice belonged to a boy no older than 12, with sun-bleached hair and curious eyes. "I'm Tommy, cabin boy. Where am I?" Isabella's voice came out as a croak. "Aboard the Siren's Call, miss. Finest ship to sail these waters." Pride colored Tommy's words. "Captain Blackwood's vessel. Captain Blackwood." The name stirred something in her chest, a flutter she couldn't quite identify. "Where is he taking me?" "Port Royal, miss. 3 days' sail if the wind holds." Tommy's expression grew serious. "Captain says you're to have the run of the ship," but he hesitated. "But what?" "Best stay away from the crew until they get used to you being here. Some of them ain't too pleased about having a lady aboard, says it's bad luck." Isabella moved to the windows, peering out at endless blue water. No land in sight. Even if she could escape, where would she go? The realization of her complete dependence on these pirates settled over her like a shroud. "Tommy, what did the captain mean when he said he needed a queen?" The boy's eyes widened. "You don't know. Miss, there's been talk for months about the Pirate Council meeting in Port Royal, all the captains gathering to choose a new leader, someone to unite the Brotherhood. But the old ways say a pirate king needs a queen to legitimize his rule." Isabella's blood chilled. "And Captain Blackwood believes I would serve that purpose." "Don't rightly know, miss, but the captain's been searching for someone special, said he'd know her when he found her." Tommy glanced toward the door nervously. "I should go. Captain wants to see you when you're ready." Alone again, Isabella examined her few possessions laid out on a side table. Her small traveling bag had been salvaged from the wreck, its contents carefully dried and arranged. Most items were mundane, a few coins, a hairbrush, spare undergarments. But one piece made her breath catch. An ivory locket, intricately carved with roses and thorns, lay among her things. She didn't remember owning such a piece. As her fingers touched the smooth surface, the locket sprang open to reveal a miniature portrait. But instead of a loved one's face, the image showed something that made her recoil in horror. Herself, pale and lifeless, floating beneath dark waters. The portrait shifted as she watched, showing different scenes of death and despair. her father's face, twisted in anguish, ships burning on distant horizons, and always, somewhere in the background, the silhouette of a man with familiar broad shoulders and storm-grey eyes. Isabella snapped the locket shut, her hands trembling. What kind of cursed thing had found its way into her belongings, and why did every instinct tell her that her rescue by Captain Blackwood was no coincidence? A heavier knock echoed through the cabin. "Miss Isabella." The voice was deeper, resonant with authority. "I believe we need to talk." Captain Blackwood had come calling, and Isabella realized her real adventure was only beginning. Captain Blackwood filled the doorway like a force of nature. In the storm's chaos, Isabella hadn't fully appreciated his presence, but now she saw him clearly. Tall and lean with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to danger, he moved with deliberate precision. His dark hair was pulled back, revealing a face that might have been handsome were it not for the network of scars that spoke of countless battles. "You're looking better," he said, stepping into the cabin with the easy confidence of someone in his own domain. "Colors returned to your cheeks. I suppose I should thank you." Isabella kept her voice steady despite the way his storm-grey eyes seemed to see straight through her. "Though I'm beginning to wonder if rescue is the right word." His mouth curved in what might have been amusement. "Direct. I appreciate that in a woman." He moved to pour himself a drink from the crystal decanter, offering her a glass which she declined. "You want to know what you've gotten yourself into?" The thought had occurred to me. Fair enough. Blackwood settled into the chair across from her, studying her face with unsettling intensity. "This ship operates under the pirate's code, as old as the sea itself. Every man aboard has sworn blood oaths to follow it. Honor among thieves isn't just a pretty phrase here, it's survival." He pulled a ring from his finger, setting it on the table between them. The black pearl at its center seemed to absorb the cabin's light, creating an aura of darkness around the simple band. This belonged to the last pirate king, dead these past 5 years. Without unified leadership, the Brotherhood has fractured into warring factions. Ships that once sailed together now prey upon each other. The Spanish Navy grows bolder every day, knowing we're divided. Isabella stared at the ring, feeling an odd compulsion to touch it. "And you believe you should be the next king?" "I know I should be." There was no arrogance in his voice, only certainty. "I've commanded these waters longer than any living captain. My crew is loyal, my ship is feared, and my reputation speaks for itself. But tradition demands more than strength." The Queen Tommy mentioned. "A pirate king without a queen is just another captain with delusions of grandeur. The old ways require balance, strength tempered by wisdom, power guided by cunning. A king rules through force, but a queen rules through understanding." His eyes never left her face. "The other captains need to see that I'm not just another tyrant seeking power. And you think I'm suitable for this role?" Isabella laughed, the sound sharp with disbelief. "I'm a merchant's daughter. I know nothing about pirates or your codes. You're more than that." Blackwood leaned forward, his voice dropping to an intimate register. "I saw how you fought in the water. Lesser people would have given up, let the sea take them, but you kept fighting, kept pushing toward the surface. That's not the spirit of a simple merchant's daughter." The ivory locket seemed to grow warm against Isabella's chest, where she'd hidden it beneath her chemise. Images from its cursed surface flashed through her mind. Death, destruction, and always that familiar silhouette watching from the shadows. "What makes you think I wouldn't simply escape at the first opportunity? Because you're still here, asking questions instead of demanding to be set ashore at the nearest port." Blackwood stood, moving to the windows that overlooked the endless ocean. "Besides, where would you go? Your ship is gone. Your traveling companions are dead. Whatever life you had before is already lost to the waves." The truth of his words hit harder than any physical blow. Her father would assume she was dead. Her intended marriage arrangements, her comfortable life in Nassau, all of it belonged to someone who no longer existed. The woman who had fought her way out of that storm was already someone different. "The other captains won't accept me easily," she said, surprising herself by speaking as though the matter was already decided. "No, they won't. Some will test you, others will try to eliminate you entirely. But if you can prove yourself worthy of this," he gestured to the black pearl ring, "if you can show them that you understand what it means to rule the sea rather than simply plunder it, then we'll unite the Brotherhood under one banner again." Isabella reached out, her fingers hovering over the cursed ring. The moment she touched it, she would be crossing a line from which there was no return. But as she looked at Captain Blackwood, at the man who had pulled her from certain death and offered her a crown made of storms and starlight, she realized the choice had been made the moment his hands closed around her wrists in those churning waters. She picked up the ring, feeling its weight, not just the physical presence, but the burden of leadership it represented. The black pearl pulsed with dark energy, and she understood instinctively that accepting this power would change her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "When do we reach Port Royal?" she asked. That night, Isabella's dreams were filled with drowning. She found herself sinking through layers of dark water, but instead of terror, there was an odd sense of homecoming. Voices whispered to her from the depths, words in languages she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. When she woke, salt tears traced down her cheeks, though she couldn't remember crying. The morning brought clearer skies and calmer seas. Isabella ventured onto the main deck, where the crew worked with the easy efficiency of men who had sailed together for years. Their conversations died as she passed, replaced by suspicious glances and muttered words she couldn't quite catch. "Don't mind them," came a voice from behind her. She turned to find a weathered man with graying hair and intelligent eyes approaching. "I'm Marcus Webb, the ship's navigator and closest thing Blackwood has to a conscience, Isabella Ashworth. Though I'm beginning to wonder if that's still true." Marcus chuckled, a sound like wind through old sails. "Identity is fluid at sea, lass. The ocean has a way of washing away what we used to be and revealing what we truly are." He gestured toward the horizon. "Come, let me show you something." He led her to a small cabin tucked beneath the quarterdeck, barely larger than a closet. Inside, charts covered every available surface, along with instruments she didn't recognize and bottles filled with sand from distant shores. "This is where I plot our course," Marcus explained, "but it's also where I keep the ship's true treasures." He opened a sea chest and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages swollen with moisture and age. "Found this floating near where we picked you up. Thought you might want it." Isabella took the journal with trembling hands. The leather was soft with water damage, but the binding remained intact. As her fingers traced the cover, moonlight from the small porthole struck the pages, and suddenly words appeared where none had been visible before. "Property of Captain Edmund Ashworth," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Your father?" Marcus asked gently. My father was a merchant, Edmund Ashworth of Nassau." But even as she spoke, Isabella felt the certainty crumbling. The journal's pages revealed maps of shipping routes, but not for legitimate trade, notes about naval patrol schedules, safe harbors known only to smugglers, and lists of cargo that included far more than legal goods. "Your father moved in dangerous waters, lass. This journal details operations that skirted the line between legitimate trade and outright piracy." Marcus studied her reaction carefully. "Some of these routes show meetings with Blackwood himself." Isabella's world tilted on its axis. Her father, who had raised her with stories of honor and honest work, had been conducting business with pirates. The comfortable life she'd known, the education, the fine dresses, all of it paid for with blood money. A particular entry caught her eye, dated just 2 months ago. "The Spanish are asking too many questions about my cargo manifests. If they discover the truth about Isabella's intended marriage, the entire operation will be exposed. Must find a way to keep her safe while maintaining the alliance." "What alliance?" she whispered, but Marcus was already turning to another page. "Here," he said, pointing to a detailed map of Caribbean waters. "Your father was running messages between pirate captains and certain sympathetic merchants in various ports. Information about naval movements, changes in trade law, warnings about raids. He was the link that kept many crews one step ahead of the gallows." The implications crashed over Isabella like a rogue wave. Her father hadn't just dealt with pirates, he had been part of their network. And her marriage, which she had thought arranged for social advancement, had been nothing more than another business transaction in his shadow empire. "But why didn't he tell me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. A merchant's daughter could move freely in society, attend social functions, gather information without suspicion. But the daughter of a known pirate sympathizer would have been watched, restricted, useless to his purposes. Perhaps he was protecting you, or perhaps he was protecting himself. Marcus closed the journal carefully. "Either way, it explains why Blackwood was so certain you were more than you appeared." He's been watching your father's operations for years. Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. Then my rescue might not have been as coincidental as it seemed, Marcus finished. But that doesn't mean it wasn't genuine. I've sailed with Blackwood for a decade. He's many things, ruthless, calculating, dangerous, but he doesn't act without purpose. If he pulled you from those waters, he saw something in you worth saving. As if summoned by their conversation, Captain Blackwood appeared in the doorway. His eyes moved between Isabella and the journal, and she saw a flicker of something, regret, sympathy, cross his features. "I see you've discovered your father's other life," he said quietly. "I was hoping to ease you into that truth. Was any of it real?" Isabella asked, her voice thick with emotion. "My childhood, my father's love for me, the life I thought I knew. Love doesn't become false simply because it exists alongside secrets," Blackwood replied. "Your father spoke of you often in his letters. Whatever else he was, his devotion to you was genuine." Isabella clutched the journal to her chest, feeling the weight of revelations that changed everything she thought she knew about herself. The black pearl ring seemed to pulse against her finger, as if responding to her emotional turmoil. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, and Isabella realized she was no longer the same woman who had fallen from that merchant ship. That woman had been built on lies and half-truths. Now, surrounded by honest pirates and cursed artifacts, she was finally beginning to discover who she truly was. The following days at sea became Isabella's education in survival. Captain Blackwood had decreed that if she was to be his queen, she needed to understand every aspect of life aboard the Siren's Call. What began as reluctant participation gradually transformed into genuine fascination. "Hi, alas, you want to see your enemy before he sees you," Marcus called from below as Isabella climbed the rigging with increasing confidence. The first day, she'd barely made it halfway up the mainmast before vertigo overwhelmed her. Now she could reach the crow's nest without pause, her hands sure on the rope despite the ship's rolling motion. The crew's attitude toward her had begun to shift as well. Where once there had been suspicion and muttered curses about women bringing bad luck, now there were nods of grudging respect. She'd proven herself willing to work, to learn, and most importantly to stand her ground when challenged. "You're getting better with the blade," observed Finn O'Malley, the ship's quartermaster, as they concluded their morning sword practice. Isabella wiped sweat from her brow, her muscles aching from the rigorous training. "But you still think too much. In a real fight, there's no time for consideration, only instinct and steel." Isabella hefted the practice sword, feeling its familiar weight. 3 days of constant drilling had calloused her hands and strengthened her arms, but more than that, it had awakened something primal within her. When the blade was in her grip, the world simplified to matters of attack and defense, survival and victory. "Show me again," she said, settling into the fighting stance Finn had taught her, the riposte from a high guard. As they sparred on the sun-warmed deck, other crew members gathered to watch. Their faces no longer showed skepticism. Instead, Isabella saw the beginning of something she hadn't expected: acceptance. These men were starting to see her not as an outsider or a burden, but as someone who might actually belong among them. "Enough for now," Captain Blackwood's voice cut through the sound of clashing metal. He approached with his characteristic measured pace, but Isabella noticed the way his eyes tracked every movement of her sword work. "We need to discuss what awaits us in Port Royal." The sparring circle dispersed, leaving Isabella alone with the captain. She sheathed her practice blade, acutely aware of how her simple brown dress now bore the marks of her new life: salt stains, rope burns, and the honest sweat of hard work. "The Pirate Council isn't a social gathering," Blackwood began, leaning against the ship's rail. "It's a battlefield where words are weapons and alliances shift like sand. The other captains will test you the moment we set foot ashore." "What kind of tests?" "Some will try to seduce you, thinking to steal you from my side for their own purposes. Others will attempt to intimidate you, to prove that you lack the steel necessary to stand beside a pirate king." His eyes grew distant, as if seeing threats that hadn't yet materialized. "A few might try to kill you outright." Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. "And you believe I'm ready for this?" Instead of answering directly, Blackwood moved to a chest secured near the wheel. From within, he withdrew something that made Isabella's breath catch, a cutlass unlike any she'd ever seen. The blade gleamed like captured moonlight, its edge so keen it seemed to cut the air itself. The hilt was wrapped in black leather, and strange symbols were etched along the fuller. "This belonged to Anne Bonny herself," Blackwood said, offering the weapon to Isabella. "Legend says it will only serve someone with a true pirate's heart." The moment Isabella's fingers closed around the hilt, the silver blade began to glow with soft, ethereal light. The symbols along its length pulsed with the same rhythm as her heartbeat, and she felt a surge of power unlike anything she'd experienced. The cutlass was perfectly balanced, as though it had been forged specifically for her hand. "Well," Blackwood said quietly, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction, "that answers that question." Tommy the cabin boy came running from the bow, his face flushed with excitement. "Captain, ship off the starboard bow, flying Spanish colors." Isabella felt the mood aboard the Siren's call shift instantly. The easy camaraderie of moments before was replaced by grim efficiency as the crew prepared for potential battle. Weapons appeared from hidden caches, and the ship's guns were loaded and run out through their ports. "Spanish Navy or treasure galleon?" Blackwood asked, accepting a spyglass from his quartermaster. "Can't tell yet, Captain, but she's flying a rear admiral's pennant." Blackwood studied the approaching vessel through his glass, his expression unreadable. "Isabella," he said without lowering the instrument, "you wanted to know if you were ready for Port Royal. Consider this your final examination." "What do you mean?" He turned to face her, and she saw something dangerous and wild flickering in his storm-grey eyes. "That's the Santa Isabella, flagship of Rear Admiral Vasquez, the man who's been hunting me across the Caribbean for 3 years. He's the reason half the pirate captains won't trust me. They think my presence brings too much heat from the Spanish Navy." Isabella gripped the silver cutlass tighter, feeling its power thrumming through her bones. "What are you asking of me?" "Help me take that ship," Blackwood said simply. "Show the crew, show yourself, and show any spies among us that you're not just playing at being a pirate queen. Prove that when steel meets steel, you'll stand and fight rather than hide below decks." The Spanish ship was close enough now that Isabella could see figures moving on its deck. Armed soldiers in red uniforms, officers with gold braid gleaming in the sun, and the massive guns that could reduce the Siren's call to splinters if given the chance. "You're asking me to help you attack a warship," Isabella said, testing the weight of the words. "I'm asking you to help me survive one," Blackwood corrected. "The Santa Isabella didn't find us by accident. Someone told them where to look." His voice grew cold as winter seas. "Before this day is done, we'll discover who among my crew has been feeding information to the Spanish. And then, my dear Isabella, you'll learn that sometimes being a pirate queen means making choices that haunt your dreams." The silver cutlass pulsed with anticipation in Isabella's grip, and she realized that the woman who had fallen from that merchant ship was truly gone. In her place stood someone harder, more dangerous, and far more alive than she had ever been in her previous life. "Give the orders, Captain," she said. "Let's show Admiral Vasquez what happens when he hunts pirates in our waters." The battle erupted with the thunder of cannon fire that rolled across the Caribbean like an approaching storm. Isabella pressed herself against the mainmast as the Santa Isabella's first volley screamed overhead, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silver cutlass in her grip blazed with ethereal light, its glow intensifying with each crash of Spanish guns. "Hard to port," Blackwood roared from the quarterdeck, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Get us alongside her." The Siren's call responded like a living thing, her black sails catching the wind as she wheeled toward the larger Spanish vessel. Isabella watched in fascination and terror as the gap between the ships narrowed. The Spanish soldiers lining the warship's rail looked impossibly professional in their red uniforms, their muskets gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Isabella," Blackwood called, "stay close to me, but don't interfere unless I fall. This is about more than just battle. It's about being seen to lead." She nodded, understanding the politics even as cannonballs whistled past her ears. The crew needed to see their future queen standing firm under fire, not cowering below decks like a frightened passenger. The ships collided with a grinding crash of timber against timber. Grappling hooks flew across the gap, and within moments the two vessels were locked together in deadly embrace. Isabella's first real battle was about to begin. For the Brotherhood. Finn O'Malley bellowed as he swung across on a rope, cutlass between his teeth. The cry was taken up by the entire crew as they poured onto the Spanish deck like a wave of vengeance. Isabella found herself swept along in the assault, the silver cutlass seeming to guide her movements as she faced her first opponent, a young Spanish officer who looked barely older than herself. His sword was fine Toledo steel, but it rang like a bell when it met her enchanted blade. "Surrender, señorita," the officer panted as they circled each other on the blood-slicked deck. "This is no place for a lady." "Then it's fortunate I'm no lady," Isabella replied, and drove her cutlass through his guard with a precision that surprised them both. Around her, the battle raged with savage intensity. The Spanish fought with disciplined courage, but they faced men who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Isabella watched Marcus Webb duel two soldiers simultaneously, his weathered face split by a fierce grin. Tommy the cabin boy darted between the combatants with a wicked knife, striking at exposed backs and undefended flanks, but it was Captain Blackwood who commanded the deck like a force of nature. His blade seemed to be everywhere at once, turning aside Spanish steel while his voice directed the battle with calm precision. Isabella understood why men followed him across the world's most dangerous waters. He was born to command in moments like these. "The Admiral," someone shouted. "Take the Admiral alive." Isabella turned to see Rear Admiral Vasquez himself, a distinguished man with silver hair and cold eyes, fighting his way toward the Spanish ship's stern. He moved with the fluid grace of a master swordsman, leaving wounded pirates in his wake. "He's mine," Blackwood snarled, pursuing the Admiral across the chaotic deck. Steel rang on steel as the two commanders met in single combat, their blades weaving patterns of death in the smoky air. That's when Isabella noticed the treachery. Quartermaster Finn O'Malley, the man who had taught her to fight, was moving with suspicious purpose toward Blackwood's undefended back. In his hand gleamed a Spanish dagger, not taken from a fallen enemy, but carried from the start of the battle. "Captain," Isabella screamed, but her warning was lost in the din of combat. Without thinking, she threw herself between Finn and Blackwood, the silver cutlass intercepting the assassin's blade with a shower of sparks. The impact sent numbing shockwaves up her arms, but she held firm. "You treacherous dog," she gasped, staring into Finn's suddenly hostile eyes. "How long have you been selling us to the Spanish? Long enough to know that Blackwood's ambitions will get us all killed," Finn snarled, pressing his attack. "At least the Spanish pay well for information." Their duel was vicious and brief. Finn was the better swordsman, but Isabella fought with the desperate fury of someone defending more than just her own life. When her cutlass finally found its mark, sliding between his ribs with surgical precision, she felt no triumph, only sick betrayal. "Isabella." Blackwood had finished his own duel and stood over Admiral Vasquez's fallen form. His eyes widened as he saw Finn's body at her feet. "What happened?" "Your quartermaster was a Spanish spy," she said, wiping blood from her blade. "He was going to kill you while you fought the Admiral." Around them, the battle was winding down. The Spanish resistance had crumbled with their leader's defeat, and surviving soldiers were throwing down their arms. The Siren's Call's crew moved efficiently through the captured ship, securing prisoners and cataloguing plunder. But Blackwood seemed focused only on Isabella, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "You saved mine first. I thought pirates believed in settling debts. Some debts can never be fully repaid." He moved closer, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "What you did today, facing down a trained killer to protect someone else, that's not something that can be taught or faked. That comes from the heart." Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Marcus Webb approached with something that made both of them freeze. In his hands was a crimson silk banner, its fabric seeming to ripple with its own inner fire. "Found this in the Admiral's cabin," Marcus said. "It's the flag of truth. I thought it was just legend." Blackwood's expression grew grim. "If the Spanish have access to that artifact, they know more about our activities than any conventional spy network could provide." He turned to Isabella. "When that flag is raised, everyone who sees it is compelled to speak only truth. No lies, no half-truths, no comfortable deceptions." Isabella stared at the banner, understanding the implications. "You want to use it to question the crew, to see if there were other traitors besides Finn." "I want you to use it," Blackwood corrected. This is your first real test as queen. The crew needs to see that you have the strength to root out treachery, even when it might hurt people you've come to care about. The weight of leadership settled on Isabella's shoulders like a heavy cloak. Around them, the crew was celebrating their victory, sharing jokes and comparing wounds in the way of warriors who had survived another battle. But among them might be others who had sold their loyalty for Spanish gold. "Raise the flag," she said, her voice carrying across the captured deck. "All hands to quarters. It's time we learned who among us can be trusted." As the crimson banner unfurled in the Caribbean breeze, Isabella saw fear flicker in several faces among the crew. The flag of truth would reveal all their secrets, strip away every comfortable lie they told themselves about honor and brotherhood. But it was the only way to ensure that when they reached Port Royal, they would face their enemies from without instead of within. Isabella had learned her first hard lesson about leadership. Sometimes protecting those you care about requires hurting them first. The flag snapped in the wind, and Isabella prepared to discover just how deep the betrayal ran. Port Royal materialized from the Caribbean haze like something from a fever dream. The notorious pirate stronghold sprawled across a natural harbor that could shelter 100 ships, its ramshackle buildings climbing the hillsides in defiance of both gravity and good sense. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, taverns and forges, while the sound of raucous laughter and occasional gunfire drifted across the water. Isabella stood at the siren's call's bow, the salt spray misting her face as she took in the sight that had terrified Spanish merchants for generations. Ships of every description crowded the harbor, sleek brigantines, heavily armed galleons, and swift sloops that could outrun any naval vessel. Each flew the colors of a different captain, and she realized she was looking at the assembled might of the Caribbean Brotherhood. "Impressive, isn't it?" Captain Blackwood joined her at the rail, his own gaze sweeping across the chaotic port. "Port Royal is the only place in the world where a man can dock his ship without questions, drink with his enemies at noon, and wake up rich or dead by morning. Or become a queen," Isabella murmured, her hand unconsciously moving to the black pearl ring that marked her as Blackwood's chosen consort. The artifact seemed heavier here, as though it sensed the proximity of the power it was meant to command. As they approached the main wharf, Isabella could see other captains waiting with their own entourages. These were men and women who had carved their legends from blood and cannon smoke, and their eyes tracked the siren's call with the predatory interest of sharks scenting wounded prey. "Remember," Blackwood said quietly, "tonight's feast isn't just about politics, it's theater. Everyone will be watching to see if you're worthy of the crown they think I'm reaching for." Their ship slid into the assigned berth with Marcus's usual precision. Almost immediately, they were surrounded by dock workers, merchants and curious onlookers, drawn by the stories of Blackwood's mysterious new queen. Isabella felt their stares like physical weight, examining every aspect of her appearance for signs of weakness or fraud. The Rusty Anchor Tavern dominated the port's main square, a massive structure that had begun life as a Spanish fort before being claimed by the Brotherhood and converted into their unofficial headquarters. As they approached, Isabella could hear the sounds of revelry already beginning, raised voices, clinking tankards, and the occasional crash of breaking furniture. "Captain Blackwood." The voice belonged to a woman whose presence commanded immediate attention. Captain Scarlett Reyes of the Crimson Dawn was everything Isabella had expected a pirate queen to be. Dangerous curves barely contained by black leather, wild red hair that caught the torchlight like flame, and eyes that promised both pleasure and death in equal measure. "Scarlett," Blackwood replied with careful politeness, "you're looking as lovely as ever. And you've brought us fresh entertainment," Scarlett purred, her gaze settling on Isabella with predatory interest. "Though I wonder if she'll last longer than your previous companions." The barb hit its mark, but Isabella kept her expression serene. She had spent the voyage learning not just swordplay and seamanship, but the subtle arts of politics and intimidation. Let Scarlett think her naive, underestimation would be her first advantage. Inside the tavern, the atmosphere was electric with barely contained violence and ambition. Pirates who spent their days trying to kill each other now shared tables and drinks, their hostility temporarily set aside in favor of more complex games. Isabella noticed how conversations stopped as they passed, how eyes followed their progress through the crowd. The main hall had been arranged for the evening's feast, with long tables forming a rough circle around a central space reserved for challenges and entertainment. At the head table sat the most powerful captains, those whose voices would carry the most weight in selecting the next pirate king. Captain Jeremiah Cross of the Black Revenge rose as they approached, his massive frame making the sturdy chair creak in protest. He was a man built for violence, with arms like ship's cables and scars that mapped decades of battles across his weathered skin. "So this is the Queen who's supposed to unite us all," Cross rumbled, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet hall. "She looks a bit delicate for the job." Before Isabella could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Appearances can be deceiving, Cross. Just ask Admiral Vasquez's crew." The speaker was Captain Elena Voss of the Storm Dancer, a woman whose reputation for cunning rivaled even Blackwood's. Her pale eyes missed nothing as she studied Isabella with the interest of someone evaluating a potential ally or enemy. "Word travels fast," Blackwood observed. "Especially word about Spanish admirals being taken alive and their ships captured intact," Voss replied. "Some are saying your new queen fought alongside you in the battle. Others claim she hid below decks until the shooting stopped." The challenge hung in the air like gun smoke. Isabella realized this was her first real test, not of sword skill or seamanship, but of her ability to command respect through words alone. "I did what needed doing," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "just as I'll do what needs doing here." She reached into her coat and withdrew something that made several captains lean forward with interest, a golden goblet she had claimed from Admiral Vasquez's personal cabin. The cup seemed to glow with its own inner light, and strange symbols danced along its rim. "This belonged to the Spanish admiral," Isabella continued, setting the goblet on the table. "Legend says it reveals the true intentions of anyone who drinks from it. Perhaps we should share a toast, to unity, to the brotherhood, and to truth among thieves." She filled the goblet with wine from the nearest bottle, the dark liquid seeming to swirl with more than just natural motion. As she raised it to her lips, conversations throughout the hall died completely. Every eye was fixed on her as she drank deeply, then set the cup back on the table. "I came here seeking nothing but survival," she said, her words carrying the ring of absolute truth. "I've found instead a purpose worth dying for. The Brotherhood is strong, but it could be stronger. United under one banner, we could rule these waters absolutely. Divided, we'll be picked off one by enemies who grow bolder every day." The golden goblet pulsed with soft light, confirming the honesty of her words. Captain Cross reached for the cup with obvious reluctance, his massive hands looking absurdly delicate as he lifted it to his lips. "I've been taking Spanish gold to report on Brotherhood movements," he said, his voice thick with shame and the compulsion of the artifact. "They promised to spare my crew if I provided information about planned raids." Gasps echoed through the hall as the admission hung in the air. Cross looked as shocked as anyone else at his involuntary confession, his face flushing red with humiliation and rage. "But I never gave them anything that would get good pirates killed," he added desperately, "only shipping schedules and patrol routes they already suspected." The goblet continued its circuit of the head table, each captain compelled to reveal truths they had never intended to share. Some confessions were minor, petty rivalries, hidden fears, secret doubts about their own crews. Others cut deeper, revealing networks of betrayal and conflicting loyalties that ran through the Brotherhood like rot through timber. When the goblet finally returned to Isabella, the atmosphere in the hall had changed completely. The careful politics and veiled threats of moments before had been replaced by a raw honesty that left everyone feeling exposed and vulnerable. "Now we know where we stand," Isabella said, her voice carrying new authority. "The question is, what do we do with the truth?" The feast continued long into the night, but the revelations from the Golden Goblet had fundamentally shifted the evening's dynamics. Where before there had been careful political maneuvering, now there was raw tension as captains reassessed alliances in light of exposed betrayals. Isabella found herself at the center of it all, no longer an outsider seeking acceptance, but a force that had already begun reshaping the Brotherhood's landscape. Captain Elena Voss approached as the crowd began to thin, her pale eyes calculating as they had been all evening. "That was either very clever or very dangerous," she observed, settling into the chair beside Isabella. forcing truth from men who've built their lives on carefully constructed lies. Sometimes the foundation needs to be cleared before you can build something lasting, Isabella replied, watching as Captain Cross sat alone at his table, nursing his shame along with his rum. His confession of taking Spanish gold had isolated him from his former allies, but the goblet had also revealed his genuine remorse and desire to protect his crew. Pragmatic, I appreciate that. Voss leaned closer, lowering her voice. There are others here tonight who won't be so forgiving of tonight's honesty. Scarlett Reyes has been whispering in corners ever since Cross's confession. She's building opposition to Blackwood's bid for leadership. Let her whisper, Isabella said, though she kept her voice equally quiet. Opposition was inevitable. At least now we know who our enemies are. Do we? Voss's smile was sharp as a blade's edge. Because I think you'll find the real test isn't surviving your enemies, it's managing your allies. Before Isabella could ask what she meant, Captain Blackwood appeared at her shoulder. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his posture, the way his hand rested casually near his sword hilt. Isabella, we need to discuss the formalities, he said. The other captains are calling for the traditional ceremony. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. What ceremony? The investiture of the Queen, Voss answered when Blackwood hesitated. It's an old tradition, dating back to the original pirate kings. Any woman who would stand as queen must first prove herself worthy of the crown. And how does one prove themselves worthy? Blackwood's jaw tightened. By accepting the emerald necklace and surviving what comes after. He gestured toward the far end of the hall, where Isabella now noticed an ornate chest had been placed on a pedestal. The wood was dark with age, bound in tarnished silver, and covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering torchlight. Even from a distance she could feel power radiating from whatever lay within. The necklace has been worn by every pirate queen for over a century, Voss explained. It's said to protect the wearer from lies and deception, but at a cost. She can no longer deceive others, even when mercy would be kinder than truth. It's not just symbolic, Blackwood added grimly. The necklace bonds itself to the wearer's life force. Remove it and you die. Fail to prove yourself worthy of its power, and it will consume you from within. Isabella stared at the chest, understanding finally why Blackwood had seemed reluctant to discuss this moment. He had offered her a crown, but every crown came with its own curse. The question was whether she was strong enough to bear the weight of absolute honesty in a world built on carefully managed deceptions. What constitutes proof of worthiness, she asked. The challenges vary, Voss said. Sometimes it's single combat, sometimes it's a test of wisdom or leadership. The necklace itself determines what trial its potential wearer must face. Around them, the remaining pirates had noticed the shift in conversation. Voices died as words spread through the hall. The new queen was about to face the investiture. Isabella could feel their eyes on her, measuring, judging, waiting to see if she would step forward or step back. Captain Scarlett Reyes emerged from her corner conference, her red hair gleaming like flame as she approached with predatory grace. Well, well, she purred. The moment of truth arrived sooner than expected. Tell me, little sparrow, are you ready to discover what you're truly made of? I suppose we'll find out together, Isabella replied, rising from her chair. The black pearl ring pulsed against her finger, as though responding to the proximity of the ancient necklace's power. She walked toward the chest with measured steps, aware that every eye in the hall was tracking her movement. This was the moment that would define not just her future, but potentially the future of the entire Brotherhood. If she failed, Blackwood's bid for leadership would die with her. If she succeeded, she would become something unprecedented, a queen who could unite the warring factions through the simple power of truth. The chest opened at her touch, revealing a necklace that took her breath away. Emeralds the size of robin's eggs were set in a framework of white gold so intricate it seemed like frozen lace. But it was the power she could feel emanating from the stones that made her hesitate. This wasn't just jewelry, it was a living artifact that would fundamentally change whoever wore it. Second thoughts, Scarlett called from behind her, mockery clear in her voice. Isabella lifted the necklace from its resting place, feeling its weight in her hands. The emeralds pulsed with soft green light, and she could have sworn she heard whispers in languages she didn't recognize. The moment she clasped it around her neck, there would be no going back. She would be bound to a life of absolute truth, unable to offer the comfortable lies that sometimes made existence bearable. But as she looked out at the assembled pirates, these men and women who had chosen a life outside society's rules, who risked everything for the promise of freedom, she realized that perhaps the Brotherhood needed someone who couldn't lie to them. The clasp clicked shut with a sound like destiny sealing itself. The emerald necklace settled against her throat, its power flowing through her like liquid fire. For a moment the world seemed to tilt on its axis as the artifact assessed her worthiness. Then the real test began. The hall around her faded, replaced by visions that felt more real than reality itself. She stood on the deck of a burning ship, faced with the choice between saving her crew or securing a treasure that could fund years of operations. She sat in judgment over a captured merchant captain, knowing that mercy might be mistaken for weakness, but that cruelty would stain her soul. Each vision demanded not just a choice, but absolute honesty about her motivations. The necklace would accept nothing less than complete truth. Even when that truth revealed flaws, she would rather keep hidden. When the visions finally faded, Isabella found herself back in the Rusty Anchor, surrounded by silent pirates who had watched her ordeal with fascination and dread. The emerald necklace had bonded with her completely, and she could feel its power coursing through her veins like a second heartbeat. "Well," Scarlet demanded, though her voice carried less mockery than before, "what did it show you?" Isabella met her gaze steadily, feeling the compulsion of absolute truth settling over her like a mantle. "It showed me that being queen isn't about power over others. It's about having the strength to be honest with yourself about who you really are." The necklace pulsed with approval, and Isabella realized she had passed the first test. But as she looked around the hall at faces filled with expectation and fear, she understood that the real challenges were only just beginning. The morning after the investiture brought unwelcome revelations with the dawn. Isabella woke in the rooms Blackwood had secured above the Rusty Anchor to find Marcus Webb waiting with grim news and a collection of weathered wanted posters spread across the rough wooden table. "These were posted at the harbour master's office during the night," Marcus said without preamble. His weathered face showed the strain of sleepless hours spent piecing together information that painted an increasingly dangerous picture. Isabella studied the posters, her blood growing cold as she recognized the face staring back at her from the aged parchment. The woman in the illustration wore fine clothes and an expression of aristocratic hauteur, but there was no mistaking the features that Isabella saw in her mirror each morning. "Lady Catherine Ashworth," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wanted for questioning in connection with the death of Governor Edmund Ashworth and the theft of Crown documents pertaining to naval defense strategies. Your father was a colonial governor," Marcus asked gently, "not a merchant as you believed." The emerald necklace at her throat grew warm, compelling absolute honesty even when the truth felt like swallowing broken glass. "I don't know what my father was anymore. Every memory I had of him has been tainted by lies within lies." She sank into a chair, studying the poster's details. The reward offered was substantial enough to tempt even loyal pirates, and the charges were serious enough to guarantee a hanging if she were captured by British authorities. "There's more," Marcus continued reluctantly. He produced a leather portfolio secured with official seals. "This arrived by special courier an hour ago. It's addressed to the pirate known as Isabella. Someone knows exactly where you are." Inside the portfolio was a single sheet of expensive paper, bearing the seal of the Royal Navy's Caribbean Fleet. The message was brief but devastating in its implications. "Lady Catherine Ashworth," Isabella read, her voice growing steadier as anger replaced shock. "Your deception has been discovered, as has the true nature of your father's activities. Governor Ashworth was indeed a Crown agent, but not in the way you might imagine. His network of merchant contacts served to funnel information about pirate activities directly to naval intelligence. His death at the hands of his own associates was both justice and warning. You have 48 hours to surrender yourself at Kingston Harbour, or we will be forced to take more direct action against your new companions." Admiral Harrison Blackthorne, Royal Navy Caribbean Fleet. The name hit Isabella like a physical blow. Admiral Blackthorne, the same family name as the man who had pulled her from drowning waters. The implications crashed over her in waves of betrayal and confusion. "Marcus," she said carefully, "the necklace's power preventing any attempt at deception. What do you know about Captain Blackwood's family?" The navigator's expression grew guarded. "What kind of answer are you looking for, lass?" "The truthful kind now. Always the truthful kind now." She touched the emerald stones at her throat, feeling their power pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Is there any connection between Captain Blackwood and Admiral Harrison Blackthorne?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with loyalties and secrets he had hoped never to reveal. Finally, the weight of her direct question and his own basic honesty won out. "Brothers," he said simply, "twins actually. Born Harrison and Henry Blackthorne, to a naval family that traced its service back 3 centuries. Henry chose a different path after their father died in a Spanish ambush, took the name Blackwood, and became everything the Blackthorne family had fought against. Isabella felt the world spinning around her. The man who had rescued her, who had offered her a crown and won her heart, was the brother of the admiral now threatening to destroy the entire pirate brotherhood to capture her. "Does he know?" she whispered. "Does Blackwood know about the message?" "Not yet. He spent the night in conference with the other captains, trying to build consensus for his leadership bid. But word will reach him soon enough. Secrets don't keep long in Port Royal." Isabella stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the harbor. Ships of every description crowded the anchorage, their crews going about the business of provisioning and minor repairs. In 2 days, this peaceful scene could become a battlefield if Admiral Blackthorne made good on his threats. "There's something else," Marcus continued reluctantly, "something you need to know before you make any decisions about what comes next." He produced a pair of dice from his coat pocket, not the ivory gaming pieces common in taverns, but artifacts carved from what looked like yellowed bone. Strange symbols decorated their faces, and they seemed to radiate an aura of foreboding that made Isabella's skin crawl. "Bone dice," Marcus explained. "They belong to the previous pirate king. Legend says they always land to show the most dangerous path forward, not the safest or wisest choice, but the one that leads to the greatest peril and potentially the greatest reward. And you think I should roll them? I think you need to understand what you're truly facing." Marcus set the dice on the table between them. "Your father was a double agent, feeding information to both sides but ultimately serving British interests. His death wasn't random pirate justice, it was an execution ordered by someone who discovered his true loyalties. The question is, was it ordered by pirates who felt betrayed, or by British agents who needed to protect their network?" Isabella stared at the bone dice, understanding that whatever they revealed would force her to confront truths she might prefer to avoid. But the emerald necklace at her throat made such willful ignorance impossible. She was bound now to face reality, no matter how painful. She picked up the dice, feeling their unnatural coldness against her palms. With a prayer to whatever gods watched over lost souls and wayward pirates, she cast them across the table. They landed showing symbols she didn't recognize, but their meaning became clear as images flooded her mind. She saw herself standing on a scaffold in Kingston Harbor, a rope around her neck as Admiral Blackthorne watched with satisfaction. She saw the siren's call burning in the harbor while Spanish and British ships closed in for the kill. She saw Blackwood's face, twisted with betrayal and rage, as he learned the true depth of her deception. But she also saw other possibilities, darker paths that led through blood and treachery to a crown that could unite the Caribbean under pirate rule. Choices that would require her to embrace the very darkness she had spent her life avoiding. "The dice never lie," Marcus said quietly. "They're showing you the stakes of the game you've chosen to play. The question is, are you prepared to see it through to whatever end awaits?" Isabella gathered up the bone dice, feeling their weight like a physical burden. Outside, Port Royal was waking to another day of commerce and conspiracy, unaware that the fate of the entire Caribbean might hang on the decisions of a woman who was still learning who she truly was. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying new resolve, "summon Captain Blackwood. It's time he learned that his queen comes with more complications than he bargained for. And it's time I learned whether the man I'm falling in love with is strong enough to handle the truth about who I really am." The emerald necklace pulsed with approval, recognizing the absolute honesty in her words. Whatever came next, Isabella would face it without lies or comfortable self-deceptions. The dice had shown her the dangerous path ahead, and she was finally ready to walk it. The confrontation with Blackwood never came. As Isabella prepared to reveal the truth about her identity and his brother's ultimatum, the morning air filled with an otherworldly sound that made every person in Port Royal freeze in terror. It was music, but not of any earthly origin. Voices that sang in harmonies too perfect for human throats, carrying melodies that bypassed the mind and spoke directly to the soul. Sirens, Marcus breathed, his face draining of color as he rushed to the window. Real sirens, not just the name painted on our bow. Isabella joined him at the glass, looking out over waters that had transformed from Caribbean blue to an ethereal silver green. Mist rose from the surface in spiraling columns, and within those ghostly tendrils, shapes moved with fluid grace. The singing grew stronger, more compelling, and Isabella felt something stirring in her blood, a resonance that seemed to answer the supernatural call. Throughout the harbor, sailors were abandoning their duties to stumble toward the water's edge. Even hardened pirates, men who had faced cannon fire and cutlass blade without flinching, were walking into the waves with expressions of mindless rapture on their faces. "We have to get below," Marcus urged, grabbing Isabella's arm. "Cover your ears, don't listen to the song. It's how they trap their victims." But Isabella found herself unable to move away from the window. The siren song wasn't affecting her the way it was affecting the others. Instead of mindless compulsion, she felt recognition, as if the voices were calling to something that had always been part of her, but had lain dormant until this moment. "Isabella!" Blackwood burst through the door, his expression desperate. "We need to get the crew back to the ship before they all drown themselves. The sirens have never come this close to Port Royal before." She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him stop short. Her eyes had changed, taking on a greenish tint that reflected the unnatural light from the harbor. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there before. "They're not here for your crew," she said, her words seeming to echo with the power of deep waters. "They're here for me." As if summoned by her acknowledgement, one of the shapes in the mist began to take clearer form. A woman emerged from the waves, walking across the water's surface as though it were solid ground. Her hair flowed like kelp in invisible currents, and her skin held the pearl-like luminescence of deep-sea creatures. Most striking were her eyes, ancient, knowing, and filled with a sadness that spoke of centuries spent watching the world above the waves. "Sister," the siren called, her voice carrying clearly across the harbor despite the distance. "You have awakened to your true nature at last." Isabella felt her knees buckle as memories flooded back, not her memories, but something deeper, older. Images of underwater cities, of women who commanded the very seas themselves, of power that predated human civilization by millennia. "What's happening to her?" Blackwood demanded, catching Isabella as she swayed. The siren continued her approach, and now Isabella could see that she carried something, a crystal vial filled with water that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "Your bloodline runs deeper than you knew, daughter of two worlds. Your father's people were not the first to claim you. My father was a merchant, a governor, a spy," Isabella whispered, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were incomplete truths. "Your father was also descended from those who once served as guardians between land and sea," the siren replied. "The blood of the first sea witches flows in your veins, awakened now by salt spray and storm, by the emerald necklace that recognizes its own kin." Isabella touched the emerald stones at her throat, feeling them pulse with renewed warmth. Suddenly the necklace's easy acceptance of her made terrible sense. It hadn't just tested her worthiness to rule pirates, but had recognized something far older and more powerful. "The water in this vial," the siren continued, now close enough that Isabella could see the intricate tattoos that covered her arms like living seaweed, "is from the fountain of youth itself, not the false spring that conquistadors seek, but the true source, the heart of the sea where all life began." She held up the crystal container, and Isabella could see swirling galaxies of power contained within. "It grants one wish to those with the blood to command it. But choose carefully, for such power demands a price that few are willing to pay." Blackwood's grip tightened on Isabella's shoulders. "Don't trust her. Sirens are creatures of deception and drowning. Whatever she's offering, it will cost more than you can afford." But Isabella was remembering more now, fragments of dreams that weren't dreams, visions of herself commanding storms and calling sea creatures to her aid. The power she had felt during their battle with the Spanish, the way the silver cutlass had responded to her touch, the strange connection she felt to the ocean itself, all of it made sense now. "What price?" she asked the siren directly. "To claim your birthright fully, you must choose between the world above and the world below. The sea will grant you power beyond imagining, the ability to command storms, to call forth sea monsters, to unite not just the pirate brotherhood, but all who sail these waters under your dominion. But such power cannot be divided. You would become something more than human, something eternal, but you would lose the ability to live fully in either world." Isabella looked at Blackwood, seeing the fear and confusion in his eyes. He had offered her a crown of storms and starlight, but this siren offered something far greater and far more terrible. "There's more," the siren continued. "Your enemies gather even now. Spanish ships mass in Kingston Harbor, and British frigates sail from Barbados. They know what you are becoming, and they fear it. With this power you could sweep them from the seas entirely. Without it, you will fall to their superior numbers and organization." The crystal vial seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat as the siren held it out toward Isabella. Around them the supernatural mist was beginning to dissipate, and the enchanted sailors were slowly coming back to their senses. But the choice before Isabella remained stark and immediate. "Choose quickly," the siren urged. "The window between worlds closes as the sun rises higher. Will you remain bound by human limitations, or will you embrace the power that has always been your birthright?" Isabella reached for the vial, her hand trembling as she felt the raw power contained within. One wish, the ability to save the Brotherhood, to unite the Caribbean under pirate rule, to become something that no enemy could stand against. But as her fingers closed around the crystal, she caught sight of Blackwood's face, the man who had pulled her from drowning waters, who had seen potential in a broken woman washing up on his deck, who had offered her a crown not because of what she was, but because of who she chose to be. "I need time to think," she said, pulling the vial close to her chest. The siren's expression grew sad, but understanding. "Time is a luxury you may not have, sister, but the choice, when you make it, must be yours alone." With that, she faded back into the mist, leaving Isabella standing on the threshold between her human life and something infinitely more powerful and dangerous. "Isabella," Blackwood said quietly, "whatever you're considering, remember that some prices are too high to pay, no matter what they promise in return." But as Isabella stared at the crystal vial in her hands, she wondered if she would have the strength to refuse power that could save everything she had come to love, even if accepting it meant losing herself in the process. The mutiny began at noon, when the sun stood directly overhead and shadows offered no place to hide. Isabella was studying charts in the rusty anchor's main room when the first blade sang from its sheath behind her. Only the emerald necklace's warning pulse saved her life, that and reflexes honed by weeks of sword training aboard the siren's call. She rolled aside as steel bit deep into the wooden table where her head had been moments before. Her attacker was Jenkins, one of Blackwood's most trusted crew members, but his eyes held the vacant stare of a man no longer in control of his own actions. "The Queen must die," he chanted in a voice not entirely his own. "The sea witch cannot be allowed to rise." More pirates poured through the tavern's doors, not strangers, but men she had sailed with, fought beside, learned to trust. All of them moved with the same eerie synchronization, their faces blank masks of murderous intent. Isabella drew her silver cutlass, the blade blazing to life with ethereal fire as it sensed the supernatural compulsion affecting the crew. Whatever was driving these men to mutiny, it wasn't natural rebellion. This was sorcery of the darkest kind. "Blackwood," she called, parrying a thrust from Tommy the cabin boy, her heart breaking as she was forced to defend herself against the child who had become like a younger brother to her. "Something's wrong with the crew." Blackwood appeared on the tavern's upper gallery, his own blade already bloodied from fighting his way through enchanted mutineers. "It's not just our crew," he shouted down to her. "Every ship in the harbor, they're all turning on their captains simultaneously." Through the tavern's windows, Isabella could see the chaos spreading throughout Port Royal. Pirates who had been drinking together peacefully an hour before were now engaged in vicious street battles. But there was something wrong with the pattern of violence. It wasn't the random chaos of drunken brawling, but coordinated attacks focused on specific targets. The captains, Isabella realized, dodging a cutlass swing from Marcus Webb, the navigator's familiar face twisted into an expression of mindless hatred. Someone's turned the crews against their leaders. She managed to reach the stairs and fight her way up to Blackwood's position, their backs pressed together as they faced the mob of enchanted pirates below. The silver cutlass in her hands was doing more than cutting flesh. Its magical fire seemed to burn away whatever supernatural influence was controlling her attackers, leaving them confused but free. "Look at their eyes," Blackwood said urgently. "There's something behind their pupils, like shadows moving in dark water." Isabella studied the approaching mutineers and saw he was right. Something alien looked out from familiar faces, something that spoke of deep ocean trenches and prehistoric malevolence. This wasn't random sorcery, it was ancient magic, the kind that predated human civilization. "The sirens," she breathed. "This is connected to what happened this morning. Someone's using the crew's exposure to their song against us." A new voice cut through the chaos, cultured, aristocratic, and coldly amused. "How perceptive of you, sister dear." The speaker emerged from the crowd of enchanted pirates like a shark rising from deep waters. Captain Scarlet Reyes no longer looked entirely human. Her red hair now moved like kelp in invisible currents. Her eyes held the black depths of ocean trenches, and her skin bore the luminescent patterns Isabella had seen on the siren that morning.
"You're not Scarlet," Isabella said, raising her blazing cutlass toward the transformed pirate captain. "I am what Scarlet chose to become when she accepted a different bargain than the one offered to you," the creature replied. "She wanted power over the Brotherhood, and the Deep Ones were happy to provide it, for a price." More transformed pirates emerged from the crowd, faces Isabella recognized, but bodies that now moved with inhuman grace and bore the physical marks of deep-sea adaptation. They had traded their humanity for power, becoming servants of something vast and alien that dwelled in the ocean's deepest places. The crystal vial was never the real test, the thing wearing Scarlet's face continued. "It was a distraction while we completed our true work, turning your own people against you, making you desperate enough to accept our offer." Blackwood snarled and leaped down into the crowd, his blade carving through enchanted pirates as he fought his way toward the transformed Scarlet. But more mutineers poured through the doors, and Isabella realized they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. "The only way to break the enchantment is to destroy its source," she called to Blackwood. "But these aren't our enemies, they're our friends being used against us." "Then we need a different kind of weapon," Blackwood replied, producing something from his coat that made Isabella's blood run cold. It was a wax seal, not the simple stamps used for correspondence, but an artifact that seemed to pulse with binding power. Strange symbols covered its surface, and touching it made the air around them thick with magical potential. "The captain's seal," he explained tersely. "It can bind any contract, even supernatural ones. But using it means making a bargain we might not be able to break." The transformed Scarlet laughed, a sound like waves crashing over broken ships. "What will you bind, little captain? Your crew's loyalty? Their lives? Your own soul?" Isabella looked at the crystal vial still clutched in her free hand, then at the captain's seal in Blackwood's grip. Two artifacts of immense power, each offering salvation at a terrible cost. Around them, the battle raged as friends fought friends under alien influence. "There's a third option," she said suddenly, understanding flooding through her like a tide. The emerald necklace at her throat was growing warm, responding to her realization. "We don't bind the crew or make deals with sea monsters. We bind the enchantment itself." She pressed the captain's seal against the crystal vial, feeling both artifacts react to the contact. Power flowed between them, raw and dangerous, but controlled by her will and focused by the emerald necklace's truth-compelling magic. "I bind this enchantment by the power of honest words and willing sacrifice," Isabella declared, her voice carrying across the entire tavern with supernatural authority. "Let no mind be controlled against its true nature. Let no soul be enslaved by promises of false power. Let every choice be made freely, with full knowledge of its consequences." The captain's seal blazed with white fire as wax flowed impossibly from its surface, sealing an invisible contract written in the very air around them. The crystal vial cracked, releasing centuries of stored power in a flash that temporarily blinded everyone in the tavern. When Isabella's vision cleared, she found the enchanted pirates blinking in confusion, their movements once again their own. The transformed creatures that had worn familiar faces were gone, leaving behind only ordinary pirates struggling to understand what had just happened, but the victory came with its own cost. The captain's seal had crumbled to dust in Blackwood's hands, and the crystal vial was nothing more than worthless glass fragments on the tavern floor. Two of the most powerful artifacts in the Caribbean had been destroyed to save a few dozen pirates from supernatural slavery. Was it worth it? Blackwood asked quietly, surveying the aftermath of the battle.
Isabella looked around at her friends, Marcus rubbing his head in confusion, Tommy staring at the blood on his hands with horror, the entire crew slowly remembering themselves after being puppets in someone else's war. "Ask me that question when we see what comes next," she replied, knowing that their enemies would not be discouraged by this setback. If anything, they would only become more desperate, more dangerous. The real war for the Caribbean was just beginning. The waters around Port Royal had turned wrong. That was the only way Isabella could describe what she saw from the Siren's Call's deck as they sailed away from the pirate stronghold, 3 days after the supernatural mutiny. The sea itself seemed infected, its natural blue-green replaced by an oily blackness that reflected no light. Worse still were the shapes moving beneath the surface, things too large and too alien to be any natural sea creature. "The Devil's Triangle," Marcus said grimly, consulting a storm glass that flickered with unnatural energy. The artifact, salvaged from a Spanish treasure ship decades ago, normally predicted weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. Now it showed visions that made no meteorological sense. Ghost ships sailing through walls of green fire, islands that appeared and vanished like mirages, and always the suggestion of something vast and hungry stirring in the deepest waters. Isabella studied the storm glass over Marcus's shoulder, her sea witch heritage allowing her to interpret the supernatural weather patterns it revealed. What she saw made her blood run cold. "We're not just entering cursed waters," she told Blackwood, who stood at the wheel with the grim determination of a man sailing toward his own funeral. "We're entering a war zone. The boundary between our world and something else is breaking down." The crew worked in nervous silence around them, their movements efficient but tense. The supernatural attack in Port Royal had shaken everyone's confidence, and the unnatural state of the sea wasn't helping morale. Even the most hardened pirates among them kept glancing over the rails with expressions of barely controlled fear. "Captain," Tommy called from the crow's nest, his young voice carrying a tremor of terror, "ships to starboard, but they're not sailing right." Isabella climbed the rigging with practiced ease, her enhanced vision piercing the supernatural gloom that seemed to hover over these waters. What she saw defied every law of nature she understood. Ships moved through the water with their sails furled, propelled by no visible wind. Their hulls bore the scars of decades underwater, yet they floated as if newly launched. Most disturbing of all were their crews, figures that moved with the stilted gait of marionettes, their faces hidden beneath barnacle-encrusted masks. "Ghost ships," she called down to the deck, "but not empty ones. Something's manning them." Blackwood joined her in the rigging, his spyglass trained on the approaching vessels. "I recognize those colors," he said quietly. "The lead ship is the Vengeful Spirit, Captain Rodriguez's flagship. But Rodriguez died 10 years ago, and his ship went down with all hands off Jamaica. Then who's sailing her now?" Before Blackwood could answer, an otherworldly horn sounded across the water. The ghost ships began to turn in perfect formation, their movements coordinated with impossible precision. As they drew closer, Isabella could see that their crews were indeed the walking dead, pirates who had drowned years or decades ago, now pressed into service by something that cared nothing for the natural order of life and death. "They're forming a blockade," Blackwood observed with the calm of a man who had faced death too many times to be surprised by its new manifestations. "Whatever's controlling them doesn't want us to pass." The storm glass in Marcus's hands began to pulse with increasing urgency, its supernatural energies responding to the proximity of the spectral fleet. Images flashed through the crystal, glimpses of possible futures that all seemed to end in violence and terror. "There," Isabella said, pointing to one particularly clear vision. "The storm glass is showing us something important." In the artifact's depths, they could see themselves standing on the deck of the lead ghost ship, but they weren't prisoners or victims. They were in command, Isabella wearing a crown of coral and sea glass while Blackwood bore a cutlass that blazed with spectral fire. The dead pirates knelt before them in apparent loyalty, their empty eye sockets somehow conveying absolute obedience. "It's showing us what we could become," Marcus said with dawning horror. "If we accept whatever bargain the dead are offering." Another horn blast echoed across the water, but this time it was answered by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were spoken in a language that predated human civilization, but Isabella's sea witch blood allowed her to understand their meaning. "Living queen of the dying waters, your time of choice has come. Accept dominion over the drowned and the damned, and your enemies will trouble you no more. Refuse, and join your voice to our eternal chorus of lamentation." Isabella felt the familiar tug of supernatural power offering easy solutions to impossible problems. The crown of coral and sea glass materialized in her hands, not an illusion from the storm glass, but a real artifact that pulsed with the authority to command the dead across all the 7 seas. "Don't," Blackwood said quietly, but there was no command in his voice. He had learned to trust her judgment, even when it led them into supernatural peril. "Think about what they're offering," she replied, studying the crown's intricate construction. Each piece of coral was carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and the sea glass fragments held swirling depths that suggested windows into underwater graveyards. Control over every pirate who ever died at sea, an army that can't be killed because it's already dead, victory over any living enemy. Around them, the ghost ships drew closer, their spectral crews waiting with the patience of the eternally damned. The storm glass showed more visions, Spanish treasure fleets fleeing before phantom raiders, British naval squadrons destroyed by enemies they couldn't hurt with conventional weapons, the Caribbean transformed into an empire ruled by the undead. "At what cost?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. The storm glass was quite clear about the price of commanding the dead, joining them in their state between life and death, becoming something that was neither fully alive nor truly deceased. Isabella held the coral crown up to catch the unnatural light that filtered through the supernatural gloom. Its weight was surprisingly heavy for something made of sea glass and dead reef, as though it carried the accumulated sorrows of every sailor who had ever drowned in these waters. "The Spanish and British fleets will be here within days," she said, more to herself than to her companions. "Our living crews can't stand against their combined might, but an army of the dead." She placed the crown on her head, feeling its power flow through her like ice water in her veins. Immediately the ghost ships responded, their crews turning to face her with something approaching reverence. The drowned pirates began to speak in unison, their voices creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. "Command us, Queen of the Drowned. Show us our enemies, and they shall join our number before the next tide turns." Isabella felt the weight of absolute power settling around her like a shroud. With a word, she could unleash devastation across the Caribbean. With a gesture, she could drag entire fleets to the bottom of the sea. She had become something that both the living and the dead would fear. But as she looked at Blackwood's face, saw the mixture of love and horror in his eyes, she wondered if the price of victory might be higher than the cost of defeat. The crown on her head whispered constantly now, filled with the voices of every pirate who had ever sought power over death itself, and every one of those voices warned her that some thrones were too dangerous to occupy, no matter how desperately they were needed. The coral crown was changing her, and Isabella could feel her humanity slipping away like sand through her fingers. Each hour that passed with the cursed artifact on her head brought new power over the dead, but at the cost of her connection to the living world. Her reflection in the ship's windows showed eyes that glowed with spectral fire, and her touch left frost patterns on everything she grasped. "You need to take it off," Blackwood said for the dozenth time since she had claimed the crown. They stood alone in his cabin while the ghost fleet maintained its protective formation around the siren's call. "Whatever power it's giving you isn't worth losing yourself." "Losing myself?" Isabella's voice carried harmonics now, echoes of the drowned that made every word sound like it came from underwater. "Or becoming something more than I was before. The Spanish fleet will arrive tomorrow, Henry. 100 ships carrying enough firepower to level Port Royal. Without the crown, we're already dead." The use of his real name, the name he had abandoned when he chose piracy over naval service, struck Blackwood like a physical blow. Isabella had never called him Henry before, had always respected his choice to become someone different. But the crown was revealing truths that cut like knives. "And what about after we defeat the Spanish?" he asked. "What happens when there are no more enemies to fight? Will you be content to rule over the living, or will you find reasons to expand your kingdom of the dead?" Isabella turned to face him fully, and he saw that her pupils had become tiny whirlpools, as if her eyes opened directly into the deepest parts of the ocean. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of centuries of accumulated sorrow. "The crown shows me things, Henry. Visions of what was, what is, and what could be. I've seen the Brotherhood's future without unity, scattered crews picked off one by growing naval forces. I've seen Port Royal burned to the ground, its ashes scattered by Spanish winds. I've seen you hanging from a gibbet in Kingston Harbor while your brother watches with satisfaction." She moved closer, and frost spread across the cabin's floor with each step. "But I've also seen what we could build together. An empire where no sailor need fear the hangman's rope, where the seas belong to those brave enough to sail them freely. The crown doesn't just command the dead, it shows the path to preventing unnecessary death." Before Blackwood could respond, a new artifact materialized on his desk, a crown made of twisted thorns that seemed to writhe with their own malevolent life. Unlike Isabella's coral crown, this one radiated pure malice, its thorns weeping drops of what looked like liquid shadow. "Where did that come from?" Blackwood demanded, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. Isabella's transformed eyes fixed on the thorn crown with an expression of recognition and hunger. "It's the other half of the bargain," she whispered, "the crown of the living dead for the crown of the dying alive. One cannot exist without the other for long." As if summoned by her words, a figure materialized in the cabin, not quite solid, but more than mere shadow. It wore the remnants of a naval uniform that had once been magnificent, but centuries underwater had transformed the gold braid into seaweed and the polished buttons into barnacles. "Admiral Cortez," Isabella said, inclining her head in a gesture that was part greeting, part acknowledgement of equal rank. "I wondered when you would appear." The spectral admiral's voice carried the sound of wind through empty rigging. "You wear the crown well, young queen, but as you have learned, ruling the dead is only half the equation. To truly command both life and death, you need a king who can bear the crown of thorns." Blackwood stared at the writhing artifact on his desk, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "That's why you rescued Isabella from the storm. You weren't looking for a queen, you were looking for bait to trap someone into accepting that abomination. The crown of thorns grants absolute dominion over all pirates, living and dead," Admiral Cortez confirmed, "but it extracts a price from its wearer. Each day drains away a portion of their humanity until nothing remains but the will to rule. Most who wear it last perhaps a year before they become something that was never human at all. Isabella reached toward the thorn crown, her frost-covered fingers hovering inches from its writhing surface. Together we would be unstoppable. The coral crown and the thorn crown, death and dominion combined. No force in the Caribbean could stand against us. Isabella, no. Blackwood caught her wrist, feeling the supernatural cold that had replaced her natural warmth. This isn't salvation, it's damnation. We'd win by becoming the very monsters we swore to fight against. Monsters! Her laugh carried the sound of waves crashing over broken ships. Look around you, Henry. The world is already full of monsters. Spanish nobles who burn villages for sport. British admirals who hang children for stealing bread. At least our monstrosities would serve a purpose. The thorn crown pulsed with dark energy, and Blackwood could feel its compulsion trying to worm its way into his mind. It promised solutions to every problem, victory over every enemy, the power to reshape the world according to his will. All he had to do was place it on his head and accept the price of absolute authority. There has to be another way, he said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Through the cabin windows he could see lights on the horizon, the Spanish fleet approaching with enough firepower to end the pirate brotherhood forever. Show me, Isabella challenged, gesturing toward the approaching enemy. Show me how we defeat 100 ships without embracing the power to command death itself. Show me how we preserve freedom without becoming something that our enemies fear more than their own nightmares. Admiral Cortez smiled, his spectral features twisting into an expression of cold satisfaction. Time grows short, Captain Blackwood. Your brother's fleet approaches from the north, the Spanish mass to the south. In 6 hours these waters will become a killing field. The crowns offer power enough to turn that battlefield into our triumph. Blackwood looked at Isabella, seeing the woman he loved disappearing behind eyes that reflected the depths of the ocean. The coral crown had already claimed so much of her humanity that he wondered if she could be saved even if she removed it now. But as his gaze fell on the thorn crown, feeling its seductive whispers promising easy solutions to impossible problems, he realized that perhaps salvation wasn't about remaining untouched by darkness. Perhaps it was about choosing which darkness to embrace, and for what purpose. If I wear that crown, he said slowly, will you promise me something? What? Promise me that when this war is over we'll find a way to take them off together. Promise me that we won't lose ourselves so completely that we forget why we started fighting in the first place. Isabella's spectral eyes flickered with something that might have been her original self, fighting to resurface through the crown's influence. I promise, she whispered, and the emerald necklace at her throat pulsed with the power that compelled absolute truth. Blackwood reached for the crown of thorns, knowing that the moment he touched it, he would begin the transformation that would either save the Brotherhood or damn them all to become legends that mothers would use to frighten children. The thorns bit deep the moment they touched his skin, and Henry Blackwood began his journey into something that had never been entirely human. Dawn brought with it the largest naval battle the Caribbean had ever witnessed. Isabella stood at the bow of the Siren's Call, the coral crown on her head wreathed in spectral mist, while behind her stretched a fleet that defied every natural law. Ghost ships sailed alongside vessels crewed by the living, their combined might creating an armada that spanned the horizon from north to south. Blackwood joined her, and she barely recognized the man she loved beneath the transformation the thorn crown had wrought. His skin had taken on a greyish pallor, and dark veins spread from beneath the crown like roots of some poisonous tree. But his eyes still held intelligence, still showed the strategic mind that had made him the most feared pirate captain in the Caribbean. The Spanish have taken the southern approach, he reported, his voice now carrying undertones of command that made every pirate within hearing straighten instinctively. Admiral Vasquez leads the van with 30 ships of the line. They're flying the colors of the Inquisition. They mean to purify these waters with fire and steel. And your brother? Isabella asked, her own voice harmonizing with the whispers of the drowned. Harrison approaches from the northeast with the entire Caribbean fleet, 42 ships, including his flagship HMS Retribution. Blackwood's expression grew grim. He's brought everything, third-rate frigates, even fire ships. This isn't just about stopping piracy anymore. He means to end it forever.
Between the two fleets, caught in the jaws of a closing trap, the remnants of the pirate brotherhood waited, with the desperate courage of those who had nothing left to lose. Isabella counted perhaps 30 vessels still loyal to their cause, a pitiful force against the combined might of 2 imperial navies, but numbers meant nothing when one commanded the dead. Isabella raised her hand, and across the spectral fleet, ancient artifacts began to respond. From the depths of the ghost ships came a weapon that had not been seen in these waters for centuries, the trident of Poseidon itself, recovered from the wreck of a Spanish treasure galleon and maintained by the spirits of drowned sailors. The trident materialized in Isabella's grasp, its 3-pronged head crackling with the power to command all the waters of the earth. but she could feel its hunger, its desire for the sacrifice that would unlock its full potential. The ancient weapon demanded a life freely given, and not just any life. It required the willing sacrifice of someone whose death would shake the very foundations of the sea. "I can feel what it wants," she told Blackwood, her voice barely audible over the growing roar of approaching battle. "A life of significance, offered without coercion. The kind of sacrifice that creates legends." Blackwood studied the approaching fleets through his spyglass, calculating distances and firepower with the cold precision the Thorn Crown had given him. "We could win without it," he said finally. "The ghost ships alone might be enough to break their formations, but the cost in living pirates would be enormous. And if we use the trident, then we command the sea itself. Every wave, every current, every drop of water becomes our weapon. But whoever makes the sacrifice..." He didn't finish the sentence. The first cannon shots rang out as the Spanish fleet opened fire at extreme range, their balls falling short but serving notice that the battle was about to begin. Isabella felt the Coral Crown's power surging in response to the threat, and around them, the ghost ships began to howl with voices that had been silent for decades. "There's something else," Blackwood said, producing an object that made Isabella's transformed heart skip a beat. It was a pearl unlike any she had ever seen. Not the cultivated gems worn by wealthy merchants, but something that looked like it had been torn from the very heart of the ocean itself. It pulsed with its own inner light and seemed to contain swirling galaxies of power. "The Pearl of Resurrection," he explained. "Found it in Admiral Cortez's Babon before he faded back to whatever realm the dead inhabit. It can bring back anyone who died within the last day, but at the cost of the user's memories. Everything that made them who they are gets sacrificed to fuel the magic." Isabella understood immediately. If one of them used the trident and died making the sacrifice, the other could bring them back. But the person who returned would be a blank slate, with no memory of their love, their struggles, their shared dreams of ruling the seas together. "A perfect trap," she murmured. "Save the one you love, but lose everything that made them worth saving." The Spanish fleet was closing rapidly now, their formation tight and professional despite the supernatural nature of their opponents. Admiral Vasquez had clearly studied reports of ghost ship encounters and developed tactics specifically designed to counter spectral vessels. Holy water blessed by Inquisition priests glittered on their cannonballs, and crosses of silver and iron adorned every mast. From the north, Admiral Harrison Blackthorn's fleet approached with equal determination. Isabella could see the HMS Retribution's distinctive profile through the morning haze, a massive first-rate ship of the line that carried enough firepower to level a coastal fortress. "Brothers," Blackwood said quietly, watching his twins approach. "It was always going to come down to brothers in the end." The trident grew heavier in Isabella's hands as the moment of decision approached. Around them, the combined pirate fleet waited for orders that would either secure their freedom forever or damn them all to become footnotes in history written by their enemies. "The sacrifice has to be willing," Isabella said, her voice carrying across the water with supernatural clarity. "And it has to matter. The trident won't accept just anyone's life. It needs someone whose death would change the course of history." Blackwood met her eyes, and in that moment they both understood. The two people whose deaths would matter most, whose sacrifice would give the trident enough power to reshape the Caribbean forever, were themselves, the pirate king and queen, united in death as they had been in life. "Together?" he asked, his hand closing over hers on the trident's shaft. "Together," she confirmed, feeling the weapon's power responding to their shared resolve. But as they raised the trident toward the approaching fleets, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced since donning the Coral Crown. Was victory worth becoming the kind of leaders who would sacrifice themselves rather than find another way? And if they died to win this battle, who would be left to ensure that their empire of the dead served the cause of freedom rather than becoming another tyranny? The Spanish ships opened fire in earnest, their holy water-blessed shot tearing through the morning air toward the spectral fleet. In minutes the battle would be joined, and the fate of piracy in the Caribbean would be decided. Isabella tightened her grip on the trident, knowing that the choice she made in the next few moments would echo through history for generations to come. Isabella never made the sacrifice to the trident. At the moment when she and Blackwood prepared to offer their lives to the ancient weapon, the ocean itself intervened. From the deepest trenches of the Caribbean rose something that dwarfed even the supernatural powers they had embraced. A presence so ancient and vast that it made the ghost ships seem like children's toys. The water around the battling fleets began to glow with phosphorescent light as a voice spoke that seemed to come from every drop of seawater simultaneously. It was neither male nor female, neither human nor entirely alien, but carried the weight of eons spent watching civilizations rise and fall like waves against the shore. Enough. The single word froze every cannon in mid-fire, stilled every sword in mid-swing, and brought absolute silence to what had been the Caribbean's most chaotic battle. Spanish sailors stared in wonder as their holy water ammunition turned to ordinary lead shot. British naval officers watched their precisely coordinated formations held motionless by currents that responded to no earthly wind. From the depths rose a pearl beyond imagination, not the small treasure Isabella carried, but a sphere of nacre, large enough to serve as a ship's figurehead. It pulsed with the rhythm of the ocean's own heartbeat, and within its swirling depths, Isabella could see the birth and death of countless worlds. The pearl of resurrection you carry is but a fragment of me, the oceanic presence explained, its words rippling through water and air alike. I am the source from which all sea magic flows, the first treasure that ever sank beneath the waves, and I am tired of watching my children destroy themselves for crowns and kingdoms that mean nothing to the eternal tides. Isabella felt the coral crown on her head growing light, its power flowing back into the greater artifact that had birthed all oceanic magic. Beside her, Blackwood's thorn crown began to crumble, the dark thorns dissolving into sea foam that sparkled with bioluminescent fire. You would take our power? Isabella asked, though she felt relief rather than anger as the crown's inhuman influence faded from her thoughts. For the first time in days, her reflection in the water showed her own eyes instead of swirling whirlpool. I would give you something better, the oceanic intelligence replied. The power was always yours, both of you. The sea witch blood that flows in your veins, the strategic brilliance that makes you natural leaders, the love that binds you stronger than any magical artifact. The crowns were never the source of your strength. They were crutches that convinced you to ignore your own capabilities. As the supernatural influences faded, Isabella realized the voice was right. The ghost fleet still responded to her commands, but now it was because they chose to follow her, not because some cursed crown compelled their obedience. The living pirates still looked to Blackwood for leadership, but because they respected the man he was, not the supernatural authority the Thorns had granted him. The battle, Blackwood said, gesturing toward the frozen fleets around them, will be decided by choices, not artifacts, the oceanic presence confirmed. Around them, the various fleets began to move again, but slowly, as if everyone involved was waking from the same strange dream. Admiral Harrison Blackthorn's voice carried across the water from the HMS Retribution's quarterdeck.
Henry, I know you can hear me, brother. This doesn't have to end in blood.
For the first time since donning the Thorn Crown, Blackwood seemed to truly see his twin brother's ship. The massive vessel flew not just British colors, but a flag of truce, white silk that caught the morning light like hope itself. He's offering to negotiate, Isabella observed, her newly clear thoughts processing the political implications. The Spanish are still flying battle colors, but your brother, he's looking for another way. Captain Elena Voss's voice called out from across the pirate formation. Isabella, the Spanish fleet is breaking formation. They're retreated. It was true. Admiral Vasquez's ships were turning away from the supernatural spectacle, their crews apparently deciding that whatever political objectives had brought them to these waters weren't worth facing sea gods and ghost fleets. The Inquisition's blessed ammunition might work against ordinary pirates, but it offered no protection against forces that predated Christianity by millennia. That leaves your brother, Isabella said to Blackwood. 42 ships against our 30, but no supernatural weapons on either side now. A fair fight, if we choose to make it one. Blackwood studied his brother's flagship through his spyglass, and Isabella could see the conflict warring in his expression. 10 years of separation, countless battles fought on opposite sides of the law, and now the moment when they would either find peace or destroy each other completely. There's something else we need to consider, Isabella said, pulling out the real pearl of resurrection. Not the massive oceanic artifact that had appeared from the depths, but the smaller gem Blackwood had taken from Admiral Cortez's cabin. If we're going to negotiate, we need to understand what we're truly offering. She held the pearl up to catch the light, and within its depths, visions began to form. Not of death and resurrection, but of possible futures, spreading out like branches on an infinite tree. In some, the Caribbean ran red with blood, as pirate and naval forces destroyed each other utterly. In others, a new kind of peace emerged, not the peace of submission, but the peace of mutual recognition between equals. The pearl shows possibilities, not certainties, Isabella explained as the visions continued to shift and change. But in every future where we find lasting peace, it requires something that neither side has been willing to give. The recognition that we're fighting for the same thing, which is freedom. The Spanish want freedom from pirate raids on their treasure fleets. The British want freedom from threats to their colonial trade. And we want freedom from the hangman's rope and the chains of conventional society. Isabella smiled, feeling truly herself for the first time since accepting the coral crown. Perhaps it's time to discover what freedom looks like when no one has to die for it. Blackwood signaled for a flag of truce to be raised on the siren's call. Across the water, his brother immediately responded with a matching signal, and gradually the two fleets began to close the distance between them. Not for battle, but for the most unusual negotiation in Caribbean history. Whatever happens next, Isabella said, taking Blackwood's hand as their ship sailed toward an uncertain but hopeful future, we face it as ourselves. No crowns, no supernatural compulsions, just two people who chose to sail beyond the horizon together. The pearl of resurrection pulsed with warm light in her other hand, and Isabella understood that its true power wasn't bringing back the dead. It was showing the living all the ways they could choose life over death, hope over despair, love over conquest. For the first time since falling into the Caribbean's waters, Isabella felt like she was truly sailing toward home. The mirror of truth appeared at the moment of decision, materializing on the table between the two brothers, as if the universe itself demanded absolute honesty for what was about to unfold. The artifact was unlike anything Isabella had seen before, not a simple reflecting glass, but a surface that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, showing not what was, but what could be if different choices were made. The negotiation was taking place aboard a neutral vessel, a Spanish merchant ship that had been abandoned during the earlier supernatural chaos, now serving as a floating conference room between the pirate fleet and the British Caribbean squadron. Isabella sat beside Blackwood, acutely aware that this conversation would determine not just their personal fate, but the future of piracy throughout the Caribbean. Admiral Harrison Blackthorne was everything his brother was not. Perfectly uniformed, clean-shaven, carrying himself with the rigid posture of a man who had never questioned the rightness of his cause. But Isabella could see the family resemblance in their eyes, the same storm-grey color that spoke of depths and dangerous currents. "You're not what I expected," Harrison said to Isabella, his tone carefully neutral. Intelligence reports described a merchant's daughter turned pirate queen. They failed to mention the sea witch heritage. "Your intelligence reports have been incomplete about many things," Isabella replied, her hand resting near the mirror of truth. "Just as ours have been about your true intentions in these waters." The mirror's surface rippled at her touch, and suddenly it displayed an image that made both brothers straighten in their chairs. It showed Harrison not in his admiral's uniform, but in the simple clothes of a merchant sailor, standing on a dock in Port Royal, with tears in his eyes as he watched a ship disappear over the horizon. "Show them what they need to see," Isabella whispered to the artifact, understanding that its power lay not in revealing embarrassing secrets, but in cutting through the lies people told themselves about their own motivation. The mirror's reflection shifted, showing Harrison as a young midshipman, receiving news of his father's death in a Spanish ambush. But instead of the patriotic fury Isabella expected, the image showed a young man overwhelmed by grief and confusion, desperately seeking meaning in a world that had suddenly become uncertain and hostile. "I became an admiral to finish what father started," Harrison said quietly, his formal composure cracking slightly. "To make the Caribbean safe for British commerce and civilization, but the more successful I became, the more I realized I was fighting shadows." The mirror showed another scene, Harrison studying intelligence reports about pirate activities, his expression growing increasingly frustrated as he realized that many of the raids attributed to pirates were actually justified responses to British and Spanish aggression against neutral vessels. "You discovered that the pirates weren't the real villains," Isabella said, understanding flooding through her as the mirror revealed deeper truths. "You learned that most of them were simply trying to survive in a world where the great powers used the Caribbean as their private battlefield." "More than that," Harrison admitted, his eyes never leaving the mirror's revelations. "I learned that Henry was protecting more than just pirates. His network of informants and safe harbors was saving anyone who fell afoul of colonial politics, escaped slaves, political refugees, merchants who refused to pay tribute to corrupt governors." Blackwood leaned forward, his expression intense. "Then why hunt me across half the Caribbean? Why build a reputation as the Royal Navy's most ruthless pirate hunter?" The mirror showed its most devastating truth, Harrison standing in the Admiralty office in London, receiving direct orders from the Crown. But the image revealed something that intelligence networks had missed. Harrison's hands shaking as he read the orders, his jaw clenched with suppressed rage at commands he found morally repugnant, but politically necessary to obey. "Because I was ordered to," Harrison said simply, "and because I thought that if I could capture you personally, I could control how you were treated. Prison instead of the gallows, exile instead of execution. I've been trying to toast your life, Henry, not end it." Isabella felt the weight of revelation settling over the small cabin. The great naval chase that had defined both brothers' lives for the past decade had been driven not by hatred or ideological opposition, but by love twisted into an impossible knot by political necessity. "There's more," she said, touching the mirror's surface again. "Show us what happens if we continue as enemies." The artifact complied, displaying a series of increasingly dark visions. The Caribbean consumed by warfare as Spanish, British, and pirate forces destroyed each other. Colonial cities burning while their civilian populations fled or died, trade routes abandoned, leaving entire communities to starve. Most devastating of all, both brothers dead, Henry hanging from a gibbet while Harrison died of wounds received in their final battle, each having destroyed the person they most wanted to protect. "And if we choose differently?" Blackwood asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella guided the mirror to show alternate possibilities. The images were lighter, filled with hope instead of despair. Ships flying new flags that combined elements of both pirate and naval tradition. Port cities where escaped slaves worked alongside former colonial administrators, all united by the goal of creating something better than what they had left behind. Most remarkably, the brothers working together, not as admiral and pirate, but as partners, building a new kind of order in the Caribbean. "It would require sacrifices from both sides," Isabella said, studying the hopeful visions. "The pirates would have to give up purely predatory raiding in favor of protecting legitimate commerce. The Navy would have to recognize pirate governance over certain territories and trade routes. A confederation," Harrison mused, his strategic mind already working through the implications. "Independent but allied states, each controlling their own waters but bound by common defense agreements and trade protocols. It could work," Blackwood agreed, "but it would require trust between people who have spent years trying to kill each other." Isabella smiled, remembering the weight of the cursed crown she had worn and discarded. "Trust is like any other skill. It requires practice, and it's easier to learn when you have the right tools." She lifted the mirror of truth from the table, feeling its power pulse through her hand. This artifact doesn't just show possibilities, it makes them more likely to happen. By seeing the future we want, we make it easier to choose the actions that will create it. Both brothers stared at their reflections in the mirror's surface, but instead of showing them as they were, it displayed them as they could become. Partners rather than enemies, builders rather than destroyers, men who had chosen hope over hatred despite all the reasons the world had given them to despair. "Where do we start?" Harrison asked. Isabella set the mirror carefully between them, its surface now showing not past regrets or future possibilities, but the present moment in all its fragile potential. "We start with a choice," she said. "Right here. Right, two brothers, deciding to trust each other enough to try building something better than the world they inherited." The mirror pulsed with warm light, and Isabella knew that whatever they decided in the next few moments would echo through Caribbean history for generations to come. The final battle came not from the enemies they expected, but from those within their own ranks, who refused to accept peace. As Isabella and the Blackwood brothers worked to formalize their historic alliance, a coalition of hardline elements from both fleets launched a coordinated attack designed to destroy any possibility of cooperation between pirates and the Royal Navy. Captain Scarlet Reyes had returned, but not as the supernatural creature she had become during the mutiny. Instead, she led a group of pirate captains who saw the proposed confederation as a betrayal of everything they had fought for. They struck at dawn, their ships emerging from a bank of fog, with guns blazing and a new artifact at the center of their rebellion. The Phoenix Feather materialized as Isabella ran to the Siren's Call's deck, responding to the crisis that threatened to destroy everything she and Blackwood had built. It wasn't a large artifact, no bigger than a quill pen, but it burned with eternal flame that cast no shadow and gave off no smoke. As Isabella grasped it, she felt its power flowing through her, the ability to rise from defeat, to transform destruction into renewal, to ensure that love could survive even death itself. "They're targeting the negotiation ship," Blackwood called from the quarterdeck, his spyglass trained on the attackers. "If they sink Harrison's vessel with the treaty documents aboard, the alliance dies before it's born." Isabella finished, understanding the tactical brilliance of the assault. Scarlet had learned from their previous encounters. Instead of trying to defeat the supernatural powers Isabella commanded, she was striking at the political foundation of their new order. But the attack wasn't limited to the pirate rebels. From the opposite direction came British frigates flying colors Isabella had never seen before, not the standard Union Jack of the Royal Navy, but a variant marked with the crossed keys of the Admiralty's most secretive division. These weren't Harrison's regular officers, but intelligence operatives who had been sent to ensure that any negotiation between pirates and the Crown ended in failure. "Admiral Blackthorne never had authorization to negotiate," Marcus called out, having intercepted signals between the rogue British ships. "These are Admiralty agents with orders to arrest him for exceeding his authority." Isabella felt the Phoenix Feather pulse with increasing heat as the situation deteriorated. The artifact was responding to the crisis, offering her the power to ensure that their cause would survive no matter what happened to any individual person. But she understood instinctively that using such power would require a sacrifice of enormous significance. "There," Blackwood said, pointing toward the neutral merchant vessel where the negotiations had taken place. "Harrison's trying to reach his own ship, but the rebels have cut him off." Through her spyglass, Isabella could see Admiral Harrison Blackthorne standing on the merchant ship's deck, sword in hand as Scarlet's pirates boarded from 3 directions. He was fighting with skill and courage, but he was vastly outnumbered and had nowhere to retreat. "He's going to die protecting a treaty that his own government will disavow," Isabella realized. "And when he does, both sides will blame the other for his death. The alliance will be destroyed, and we'll be back to war within a week." The Phoenix Feather burned brighter in her hand, showing her what was required to save the alliance, to ensure that the confederation they had envisioned could actually come to pass. Someone needed to make a sacrifice so dramatic, so undeniably heroic, that it would shame both sides into honoring their agreement. The artifact offered her the power to stage such a sacrifice, and to rise from it when the time was right. Isabella, no. Blackwood had seen the same realization in her eyes. Whatever you're planning, there has to be another way. Look around, Isabella said, gesturing toward the chaos erupting across the water. Scarlet has 30 ships and crews that have been preparing for this moment for weeks. The Admiralty agents have enough firepower to level Port Royal. Your brother has 42 ships, but half his captains are probably questioning whether they should obey orders from an admiral who's negotiating with pirates. She raised the phoenix feather, and its eternal flame spread to encompass her entire form without burning her. But if the pirate queen dies saving a British admiral, if I give my life to protect the man who was supposed to be my greatest enemy, then neither side can claim the moral high ground over the other. They'll have to honor the alliance, because the alternative would be admitting that my sacrifice was meaningless. And then what? Blackwood demanded. Even if the phoenix feather can bring you back, how long will it take? Days? Months? Years? What am I supposed to do while you're dead? Isabella smiled, feeling the artifact's power showing her the shape of the future she was choosing. You're supposed to rule both fleets, the entire Confederation. You're supposed to be the king this alliance needs while I'm gone, and trust that when I return, we'll be stronger together than either of us could be alone. She kissed him then, feeling the phoenix feather's fire pass between them. When they separated, she could see her own flames reflected in his eyes, ensuring that part of her power would remain with him during the time they would be apart. How will I know when you're coming back? He asked. You'll know, Isabella promised, then dove from the Siren's Call's rail into the Caribbean waters. The phoenix feather carried her through the water faster than any natural swimmer could move, wreathing her in protective fire as she approached the merchant vessel, where Harrison fought for his life. She surfaced behind Scarlet's boarding party, the eternal flames making her appear like an avenging angel, rising from the depth. Scarlet, Isabella called out, her voice carrying across the water with supernatural clarity. If you want to kill a queen, here I am, but leave the admiral out of your war with me. The pirate captain turned, her eyes widening as she saw Isabella surrounded by fire that reflected off the water like a second sunrise. So the sea witch shows herself at last. Come to die for your British lover, come to live for something bigger than any of us, Isabella replied, raising her cutlass as the phoenix feather's power flowed through the silver blade. Come to show everyone watching that some things are worth more than the hatred that divides us. The battle that followed would become legend throughout the Caribbean, the duel between two queens, while fleets watched in awed silence. Isabella fought with skill enhanced by supernatural fire, but she could feel the phoenix feather's true purpose guiding her actions. This wasn't about winning or losing, it was about creating a moment so profound that it would change how everyone present understood the meaning of sacrifice and honor. When Scarlet's blade finally found its mark, piercing Isabella's heart as the phoenix feather's flames reached their peak intensity, the silence that followed was absolute. Pirates and naval officers alike stood transfixed as Isabella smiled, her hand still grasping the eternal flame that would ensure her return. Remember this moment, she said, her voice carrying to every ship in both fleets. Remember that love conquered hatred, that hope defeated despair, and that sometimes the greatest victory comes through willing sacrifice. The phoenix feather erupted in a pillar of fire that reached toward the heavens, and when it faded, Isabella was gone, but the flame continued to burn on the water where she had fallen, a beacon that would guide her back when the time was right. 3 months later, Isabella opened her eyes to find herself lying on a beach she didn't recognize, with waves gently lapping at her feet and the phoenix feather's eternal flame still burning softly in her palm. The resurrection had taken longer than she expected, but as she sat up and looked around, she could see that the world had not waited for her return. The beach belonged to a small island that bore the flags of the new Caribbean Confederation, a banner that combined elements of both pirate and naval traditions into something entirely unprecedented. Ships moved peacefully in the harbor, their crews a mixture of former pirates and Royal Navy sailors working together with the easy familiarity of long partnership. But the most remarkable sight was the pair of figures walking toward her along the shoreline. Blackwood, looking older and bearing the weight of command in his posture, and beside him a woman, Isabella, didn't recognize. She was beautiful in a quiet way, with kind eyes, and the practical dress of someone who worked with her hands, rather than commanding from a quarter-deck. "Isabella," Blackwood said, his voice carrying joy, relief, and something else, a note of awkwardness that made her heart skip with sudden uncertainty. "You're back. Told you I would be," she replied, rising to her feet and feeling the phoenix feather's power, settling back into dormancy now that its purpose had been fulfilled. "Though it seems I've missed quite a lot." The woman beside Blackwood stepped forward, and Isabella could see now that she wore a simple gold band on her finger, a wedding ring that matched the one on Blackwood's hand. "This is Sarah," Blackwood said gently. "My wife." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow, but the phoenix feather in her hand pulsed with warm understanding, helping her see past her initial shock to the deeper truths beneath. Blackwood had aged during her absence, yes, but more than that, he had healed. The driven intensity that had marked him as a pirate captain had been replaced by something steadier, more sustainable. "The Confederation needed a different kind of leader than I was when you knew me," Blackwood continued, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. "Someone who could build institutions instead of just winning battles. Sarah helped me become that person." Isabella studied the woman who had taken her place, seeing not a rival, but a partner who had given Blackwood something Isabella never could have. The stability and groundedness that had allowed him to transform from a pirate king into a statesman. She was, Isabella realized, exactly what the Confederation had needed during its vulnerable early years. "Tell me what you built," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Over the following hours, as they walked through the thriving port city that had grown up around the Confederation's capital, Isabella learned about the world that had emerged from her sacrifice. The alliance between former pirates and reformed naval officers had created something unprecedented, a maritime federation that controlled trade routes through cooperation rather than conquest, that protected merchant shipping while maintaining the freedom that had drawn people to piracy in the first place. "Your death changed everything," Sarah explained, as they toured a school where former pirate and naval officers taught navigation and seamanship to children from across the Caribbean. "When both fleets saw you die to save Admiral Harrison, it became impossible for either side to claim moral superiority over the other. They had to work together or admit that your sacrifice was meaningless." "And Admiral Blackthorne serves as the Confederation's naval commander," Blackwood said. "He and I have learned to be brothers again, rather than enemies. Your sacrifice didn't just save his life, it saved our relationship." As the day wore on, Isabella began to understand the true power of what the phoenix feather had accomplished. Her death hadn't just created a political alliance, it had transformed the very nature of power in the Caribbean. Instead of rule through fear and force, the Confederation governed through consensus and mutual benefit. But understanding the necessity of what had happened didn't make it hurt less. As evening approached and they stood together on the harbor wall watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Isabella finally asked the question that had been building in her heart all day: "Is there still a place for me here?" Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on the simple wedding rings that had materialized as the final artifact of their story. Bands forged not from stolen treasure, but from metal, freely given by every ship in the Confederation, representing the willing unity they had all chosen. "There will always be a place for you," he said finally, "but not the place you had before. That person died on the merchant ship, and the world moved on. The question is, who do you want to become now?" Isabella looked out over the harbor, seeing ships that flew the Confederation's flag sailing toward horizons that promised trade and exploration rather than conquest and plunder. The phoenix feather in her hand had given her the gift of resurrection, but it couldn't give her back a life that had already been completed. "I want to explore," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "The Confederation has brought peace to the Caribbean, but there are other oceans, other waters where people might need to learn that there are alternatives to endless war." Sarah smiled, and for the first time since her resurrection, Isabella felt truly welcomed rather than merely tolerated. The Confederation's first expedition to the Pacific launches next month. They could use a navigator who understands both the practical and supernatural aspects of long-distance sailing, and someone who knows firsthand that the most important discoveries happen when you're willing to let go of who you used to be. Blackwood added. As night fell over the Confederation's capital, Isabella made her choice. She would sail again, not as a pirate queen seeking conquest, but as an explorer carrying the hard-won wisdom of sacrifice and resurrection to waters that had never known the possibility of peace between enemies. The phoenix feather's flame flickered one last time in her palm before going dormant. Its work finally complete, Isabella had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes love meant letting go, that sometimes victory required accepting that the world could be better without your direct involvement, and that sometimes the greatest adventure was discovering who you could become when you stopped trying to be who you had been. But as she prepared for her new journey, Isabella carried with her the wedding rings she had helped create. Not symbols of her loss, but reminders that the love she and Blackwood had shared had transformed into something larger and more lasting than any personal relationship could be. They had become part of the foundation upon which others could build their own stories of hope and transformation. The Caribbean stretched endlessly before them all, no longer a battleground but a gateway to infinite possibilities. And somewhere beyond the horizon, new waters waited for explorers, brave enough to sail beyond the edge of the known world.